So.
Good afternoon, and welcome to today's webinar on the newly initiated Georgia Drawdown project. We're so pleased to have such a great turnout. The goal of the Georgia Drawdown initiative is to identify the most promising solutions for achieving carbon neutrality in Georgia. Ultimately, we hope to inspire a transformational vision that will motivate Georgians and businesses, institutions, neighborhoods, towns, and cities across the state to reduce their carbon footprint. This initiative has been made possible by funding from the Ray C. Anderson Foundation, which is greatly appreciated. It's a philanthropic organization that has been a steadfast supporter of carbon drawdown projects in the state of Georgia. My name is Marilyn Brown, and I'm a Regents and Brooke Briers professor in the School of Public Policy at Georgia Tech, where I created and lead the Climate and Energy Policy Laboratory. And I'm going to be the MC for this 1-hour event, along with my superstar co-hosts from Georgia Tech, Emory, and the University of Georgia. I would like to ask each of them to introduce themselves at this point. Kim?
Yes, hello everybody. My name is Kim Cobb. I am the Georgia Power Chair, Professor in the Earth and Atmospheric Sciences at Georgia Tech, and also the Director of our Global Change Program there.
And I'm Michael Oxman. I am the Managing Director of the Ray C. Anderson Center for Sustainable Business over at Scheller College of Business here at Georgia Tech.
Hi everyone. I'm Daniel Rothenberg, and I'm here at Emory University with my colleagues, and I'm the Chief Strategy Officer of our Climate at Emory initiative, and delighted to be working with this team and with all of you on this project.
And hello, I'm Marshall Shepard at the University of Georgia. I'm the Director of the Atmospheric Sciences Program and the Georgia Athletic Association Distinguished Professor, also in a room full of colleagues from the University of Georgia.
All right, welcome everyone. So before we begin our presentations, I wanted to let everyone know that you can activate your Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to write in questions. And you also have the ability to upvote a question, a new term I learned yesterday. So if you see a question that you like, you click on the thumbs up icon below that question, and that will emphasize it as we work through the set of questions, the long list of questions we hope you will all provide to us. Actually, the people working through those questions are going to be Jake Rogers and Jeff Hubbs. They're sitting here. They're going to provide us with an assortment of questions to tackle midway through our presentations and then again at the end. So we'll have 2 opportunities for Q&A during our talk. So I'd like to introduce Daniel Rothenberg first up on the agenda, who is going to explain the motivation for the Georgia Drawdown project.
Great, thanks a lot, Marilyn. And again, thanks to so many of you for expressing interest and joining today. We're looking forward to sharing this with you. As you'll see, it's early days for us. And so we're excited to share with you what we're planning to do and to get your input. What I want to do is just cover why we're doing this. And I'm going to start with the big picture, and the main motivator, of course, is climate change. Climate change presents very real risks to us here in Georgia and across the globe. For those who haven't seen this picture, it's actually an infographic. You've got global average temperatures from 1850 on the left-hand side to 2017 on the right, and each vertical stripe is a year, and blue stripes are colder than the average, and red stripes are warmer than the average. So if you look from left to right, you see a really striking trend over the past couple of decades. And actually, if you add in this last year of data, 2018, we've now had 18 of the 19 warmest years on record since the year 2000. So we're in an incredible moment here on the planet with respect to climate change. And of course, this warming then has very direct impacts and costs and risks for our lives, our livelihoods, and the natural systems on which we depend. The flip side, of course, is if we can be pretty clear-eyed about these risks and proactive about managing them, there are some real opportunities for us here in Georgia and across the world. When we think about climate solutions, we think about them in 2 ways. Of course, the first way is to deal with the impacts that we're experiencing now and those that we're projected to experience in the future. And the more we're able to adapt to and build resilience to those impacts, we have a real opportunity to minimize the costs that we are likely to experience. And that's obviously going to be very important for lives and livelihoods. This picture here is actually an example of a homegrown innovation in Southwest Georgia. We have a bunch of farmers, as many of you know, working with UGA and others on some innovative smart irrigation practices, which will allow those farmers to produce a lot more crop in a regime where we're expecting a lot more variability in our water systems. The other side of the coin then is to, of course, stop the problem where it's starting by reducing our net emissions of greenhouse gases of carbon pollution. And when we say net emissions, we're talking about the combination of emissions coming up and going into the atmosphere, as well as sinks that are drawing those emissions down, either through natural or artificial processes. The scope and scale of this task and challenge is immense. If we want to achieve the most ambitious goals laid out by the global community, the latest estimates are that we have until roughly mid-century to have the entire planet have net zero carbon emissions. That is upwards of 8 or 9 billion people on net having zero emissions. If we want to be a little bit less ambitious and go to a 2-degree target, then we have till 2070 to achieve the same goal. It's quite an ambitious requirement that we have. Another way to look at it, though, is there are some amazing economic opportunities coming down the pike over the next several decades. And we in Georgia have a real opportunity to position ourselves as potential leaders in that economy of the future. And that's a really important way, we think, to think about the greenhouse gas and carbon challenge. Addressing this challenge at that scale and over that time frame is going to require very new thinking, creativity and innovation, thinking outside the box. This picture is actually an example of another homegrown innovation from Interface when Ray Anderson was the CEO, where they were one of the first companies in the world to pioneer recycling of carpet rather than generating new carpet backing, which was a huge financial savings and of course a huge emissions and pollution savings. That's the kind of thinking that we need to bring to this problem at a global scale and here in Georgia. We are all doing this because we've all been inspired by the work that many of you all have seen that Project Drawdown has done. For those who haven't seen it, you can find it at drawdown.org, or you can get the book on Amazon or anywhere else. What Drawdown sought to do was to look at this big problem and think about what are the 100 most promising solutions that can solve this problem at scale. And they introduced this phrase of drawdown to mean the point of time at which the overall levels of pollution in the atmosphere start to decrease. We're no longer pumping more in, and in fact, concentrations are starting to draw down. What Drawdown did was 2 very exciting things. First, they framed their entire conversation around solutions and around hope. And I think a lot of us had been yearning for that kind of narrative and a way to think about this issue, not just about the concerns about the impacts, but more about the optimism about what we can do to address them. The second thing that Drawdown did that was quite exciting is they looked well beyond the traditional engineering toolkit of solutions. So they did look at solar and wind and efficiency and a bunch of other options, but they also looked at gender equity and educating girls and reducing food waste. And they found another number of solutions that really rose to the top in their analysis that folks weren't really talking about at a global scale before. The only drawback of what Drawdown did is that they did it at a global scale, and it's very hard for us here in Georgia to figure out which of those solutions is most relevant here in Georgia. And that's exactly the motivation then for the project that is underway now and that we're talking about today, which is to bring a Georgia lens to this kind of analysis. So that's the context. I'm going to turn it back over to my colleagues for the rest of the agenda.
All right, thank you very much, Daniel. This is Marilyn again. I'm going to walk through the project, giving an overview, starting again with the goal, which is to identify the most promising solutions for achieving carbon neutrality in Georgia. Again, the time frame 2020 to 2050, but with a particular focus on 2030, recognizing the increasing evidence that early action is needed. The approach involves starting with 100 project drawdown solutions that were identified in the global assessment 2 years ago, and then add new solutions by pulsing our experts.
For those of you who know Georgia Tech well, this is their hourly whistle, so we're going to wait a second until Marilyn is done surviving a whistle. Hold on one second. While we're
But-
doing that, just I think we've got 145, 147 participants. So thanks to all of you for joining.
I thought we had that, nailed. It was going to be while Daniel was talking. All right. So again, starting with 100 solutions, adding to them where there are different solutions that might be important to consider in the state of Georgia, identifying the most promising of these solutions in several stages with increasing levels of rigor and analysis, and then down selecting to smaller subsets as we phase through the project and eliminating those that are not pertinent, such as tropical rainforests, for instance. For each solution, we're going to assess the carbon reduction potential and the cost in Georgia. In addition, we'll be looking beyond carbon at economic development, public health, the environment, and equity. After all, as many have noted, low carbon transitions have the potential for costs and benefits to be distributed just as unequally as our historical transition to the fossil-based world we live in today. Guiding principles include we want to use quantitative, rigorous, objective analysis. We need to provide a foundation for future efforts that will stand the test of time. Our numbers need to be based on public domain data as best as is possible. And we're going to tap and develop the expertise of Georgia's network of scientists, engineers, stakeholders, and the full gamut of interested parties to create a level of excitement and buy-in to be able to motivate us to move forward. Now, we can think of our project as having 3 phases: the summer, the fall, and the spring. So as we toggle through this, we are going to start with identifying the top tier of solutions, developing a baseline of emissions. Now we've done that. We have looked at the historic trends of energy consumption and CO2 emissions, and in the appendix to our PowerPoint presentation today, you'll see a number of graphs that you can examine later. What we've seen in looking at the past 10 years is that the situation in Georgia has improved slightly. Our energy consumption has reduced from about 2.9 to 2.6 quads, or 2,900 to 2,600 trillion BTU. That's the unit we'll be using today. Let's keep on going. So if you think of our solutions as a chessboard, each of those pieces is one of the 100 solutions that we have begun to explore from the global project. And we're going to then proceed by adding solutions that aren't on that global list. And we're going to rule out those that are clearly not relevant to Georgia. We'll gather initial data based on costs and carbon for all the solutions, and we'll identify top tier solutions for further study. Then we'll move into the fall timeline, where we'll be conducting more detailed analysis of cost and carbon, and more detailed analysis of the beyond carbon attributes at that point. We're going to identify a much smaller subset for final analysis. And then in the spring, we'll be examining 10 to 12 solutions, detailing their attributes, including their beyond carbon characteristics, jobs, equity, health, etc. And we're going to end with the creation of a interactive web portal, which will survive this project and serve the purposes of carbon drawdown in Georgia for the long run. And we're going to have a public rollout of our findings that hopefully will motivate continued enthusiasm and work going forward. So with that, I'd like to hand off to Kim Cobb, who's going to talk about our team.
Great. Thanks so much, Marilyn. So that's a pretty ambitious agenda and timeline that we have in front of us, and we've amassed a very large group, very good structure of teammates here across the lead institutions, faculty, and students and research scientists from UGA, Georgia Tech, and Emory. And so at the core of this effort is the core team of faculty from the different institutions listed on the top there. And then as you can see, we've broken down these analyses into 6 working groups distributed across these institutions. The first 3, electricity generation, transportation, and the built environment materials, are at Georgia Tech. The 4th and 5th, the food, agriculture, land use and forestry working groups, are based at UGA. And the 6th is spread between Georgia Tech and Georgia State, with several other supporting roles as well in that group. And we'll be able to dive a bit more into that in a little later. But we also are taking advantage of some local expertise as consultants in this group. And we have administrative assistants and project support team that extends to another 20 or more people who are playing key roles in developing technical expertise for the project as well. And so moving on to the analysis of the core team and who is involved in that effort. Obviously, you've met many of us here, not introduced as of yet was Beryl Toktai, who rounds out our core team. And the core team is really in charge of coordination amongst the different groups and moving the project forward on a good timeline and making sure we're on track, as well as managing stakeholder engagements between internal and external community groups, and then as well with course communications and outreach efforts such as we're doing today, making sure that we're involving community like you as we go forward. Next slide. Okay, so here is a quick look at our working groups, and we're not going to be able to spend too much time here, but wanted to list the leads. Dr. Marilyn Brown and Dr. Santiago Grijalva from Working Group 1 focus on electricity generation. And you can see there listed many of the solutions that are falling into that working group's purview. Again, not to spend too much time there, but to give you an idea of the types of solutions that this working group will be chewing on as they move forward through their process. Next slide. So Working Group 2 is focused on transportation, and that's led by Dr. Rich Simmons of Georgia Tech and Michael Rogers, also from Georgia Tech. And here are some solutions listed under the transportation working group, noting that, of course, some of these, like electric vehicles, will span across Working Group 1 in this case and Working Group 2. And this is a good time to recognize that we don't envision these working groups as silos with solution sets that only belong to consideration for that working group, but that the consideration of solutions that cross working group boundaries is a really important part of this analysis, something that Project Drawdown focused on at the global level, and we will be keeping a close watch on those solutions that require that level of integration and coordination across our own solutions as well. Next slide. Working Group 3 focused on the built environment and materials, led by Dr. Daniel Matisoff and Dr. John Taylor from Georgia Tech. Again, a very long list of solutions under this particular working group, with a lot of cross-cutting themes into other working groups, including Working Groups 4 and 5 on the forestry, and of course the grid and transportation. Next slide. Working Group 4, again, moving to the UGA-led working groups. This is focused on food and agriculture, led by Drs. Sudagar Mani and Dr. Jeffrey Mullen at UGA. Again, recognizing that agriculture is a critical component of Georgia's economy and a good portion of our land use. This is really an exciting opportunity to recognize those techniques and solution sets that will enhance that sector's capabilities in Georgia and beyond, while recognizing that there are opportunities to increase efficiencies and, of course, potentially sequester carbon in some of these solutions, moving to the sink side of the equation. Next slide. And lastly, land use and forestry from Working Group 5, also led by UGA, Dr. Jacqueline Mohan and Dr. Puneet Dwivedi on the side, looking at those carbon sinks that involve our forestry sector, again, a very important part of the Georgia economy. And of course, a very large potential for large-scale carbon sequestration and or energy in built environment applications. Next slide. And last but not least, certainly is the addition of a Beyond Carbon working group that sits as in a cross-cutting role across all of the working groups, supporting a look at the co-benefits as they fall into public health impacts, equity considerations, jobs and economic growth, and of course, environment and biodiversity. We'll be speaking a little bit more about this in the next slide, so I won't dwell too far other than to say that this is led by Dr. Michael Oxman, Dr. Laura Taylor, and Dr. Bel Toktai from Georgia Tech, as well as Dr. David Ivanovich from Georgia State University. And we'll touch on this further in the next slides. Thank you.
All right, I see that we have some active Q&A activity here. A number of questions have come in on the type of financial analysis that we'll be doing, and also on our contacts with key political leaders. Daniel, can I let you address the contacts with the legislature and governor, et cetera?
Yeah, I'll address sort of both of these together. There's one question about, have we been in touch with policymakers on this? And the other one related, is there, we're planning a financial analysis, or what about a political analysis? And I would say that right now, this is, the emphasis here is really on the analysis side. So we are not, at this point, looking at particular policy levers or accelerants that might move any of these things forward. Right now, we're starting with simply, what are the possible solutions? What are their carbon potentials? What are their cost potentials? And what are the beyond carbon implications? That said, as Marilyn will address a little bit more later, for each of those solutions, we are looking at a number of scenarios. But the operating principle is to start with what is currently available and look at projections as much as possible that are off the shelf of where these things are going as a baseline, and then look into possible other scenarios. But all that to say, I think right now, this is a first phase of conducting this analysis without prejudging any particular policy solution. And then just to round it out, with respect to engagement of policy officials, that's exactly why we're actually having this conversation now, which is to reach out to folks from the public sector, the private sector, the nonprofit sector, and others in the academic sector to engage early in this process as it just gets underway, and to start up that conversation.
Now, I might mention that in the financial analysis, we will be working with our experts on equity, and we know that access to capital and inclusive financing is really critical. So we'll be looking at both upfront costs and implications for operating costs, but not trying to craft the types of policies that would be required to address the financial and investment needs that would perhaps come in a subsequent phase down the road. We realize it is an important issue, so thank you for those questions. All right, I recommend that we keep on going, unless Jeff or Jake, you've spotted another upticked set of questions.
Just what's there.
Okay, all right. Okay, well then I'd like to talk about some of the initial work that we've done over this past quarter since we've been at it. Let's see, can we eliminate the questions on the screen? Or maybe I need to do that. Excuse me. There we go. Okay, this is a photograph from a meeting in December last year where we got together with the Ray C. Anderson Foundation leaders, as well as Chad Frischman, who's a vice president of the project Drawdown, located in California. And we were briefed on the modeling approach that was used to develop the estimates of costs and carbon reduction potential globally of the 100 solutions that we have begun to study. And we've looked at their spreadsheets and their assumptions, and have really benefited from leveraging the good work done to date. In addition, we have begun to analyze the Georgia-specific energy and greenhouse gas conditions. So we've done this thanks to Rich Simmons, call out to him for saying, you should use Sankey diagrams. So let me explain what these are. This is a Sankey diagram of energy consumption for the state of Georgia in the year 2017. Hot off the press, these energy numbers for 2017 were just published the last week of June. So on the left side in trillion BTU units, you see the energy that's being consumed for electricity generation up at the top, and for through petroleum, mostly for transportation, as the bottom path. And then in between, you have a number of other energy uses where the end users, such as businesses and industry, consume the natural gas, renewables, or coal and some petroleum directly. So we've got electricity as a large single consumer of energy, petroleum, another large single energy use source, and then an amalgamation of other smaller bits and pieces. So as you move to the right, you see first the separation of waste from productive energy. So when you generate electricity, more than half is typically wasted, not going productively to use. When you move over to the right side, then you can see that between transportation, commercial, residential, and industry, we have very large segments of usage. So let's go to the CO2 Sankey. So when you convert energy use to CO2, many of the original energy resources disappear from your Sankey. So you don't see nuclear, you don't see renewables in the generation of electricity, although there is a tiny little bit of biomass that does, our experts tell us, have a carbon footprint. So we have positioned them, biomass in particular, there. But the dominant sources are the fossil fuels. So we can see, going from left to right again, the CO2 sources based on fuels, and then the CO2 emissions from individual types of consumers. Now, what you need to appreciate here is that we have a total of 142 or so million tons of CO2 emitted from the use of energy in Georgia. That does not include CO2 that's released from industrial sources that also may consume fossil fuels, such as cement. It does not include other gases, for instance, methane, NOx, nitrous oxides, and the fluorinated gases. It also doesn't include the sinks in Georgia. And there, of course, forests are so important. So this is not a net number. This is just a very big number, which does account for probably 80% of the total greenhouse gas emissions in the state, although don't hold me to that because we're still looking into the remaining sources. All right, let's go then to the next slide. And this shows you just a portion of the template that we've developed that we're using to characterize the 100 solutions, at least initially in a fairly cursory fashion. And then as we reduce the solutions and study them in greater detail, this template will evolve and gain greater detail. So now with that, I'd like to have Michael Oxman tell us about the Beyond Carbon work that we'll be doing.
Thank you, Marilyn, and hello, everyone. I just wanted to kick off by saying that in addition to carbon solutions and technological solutions for reducing carbon, we are considering some of the less traditional solutions that were included in Project Drawdown around education and awareness. In addition to that, we are spending a lot of our time looking at the beyond carbon aspects of the various solutions that are flowing through the different working groups. And we're doing that, I think Kim mentioned this early on, we're doing that in sort of across 4 dimensions. One is environment, the second is economic development and jobs, the third is public health, and the fourth is equity. And the idea here is to consider both the intended and unintended consequences, i.e., some of these will have very, very clear benefits on, for example, switching to solar will have very positive benefits on air quality, but perhaps residential solar may not have such strong benefits for equity, or biomass may have very significant impacts on water use. So we want to make sure that we're looking at each of these solutions, particularly the ones that are elevated with the highest carbon impact, to look at them as holistically as possible. And then the idea would be to work on those solutions that are elevated to ensure that they are enhancing the benefits that they can create across these 4 categories and mitigating any adverse impacts that they might have. In terms of engagements, we are very keen to have the various stakeholder groups that are represented in the slide and others that we may have missed suggest ideas both for solutions that less traditional solutions that may be missing, but also to make sure that we are taking full consideration of other beyond carbon impacts. And the mechanism for that will be a survey that we will be providing to folks to help us think these issues through, as well as the other engagement that my colleague, Dr. Marshall Shepard, will be talking about next, I believe.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Part of this effort is not just an exercise for academics in the ivory tower. It is essential that we engage with the public stakeholders and practitioners. And so this is really sort of at the heart of what this particular webinar is about, because we are looking for input. That's what we wanted to start with. There are engagement opportunities for those of you out there listening and partaking in this webinar. First, what other solutions should we be considering? We don't claim to have all of the answers here in this initial phase. And so the next step in acquiring that information will be a questionnaire that will be posted on the georgiadrawdown.org website. That survey or questionnaire is not in place yet, but will be very shortly. So we encourage you to go ahead and log onto that website, bookmark it, and keep a close eye on it. We will also have other ways of pushing information when the questionnaire is available. Number 2, how would subject matter experts rank these solutions, and what carbon issues should we be considering? Now, this is going to involve, again, engagement with our working group leads who you've met in previous slides. You'll be working with expert focus groups, those working groups will be, to get feedback through multi-phase survey opportunities. We will provide information in the next slide on how to contact those working groups and engage. And then thirdly, do you, those of you out there in webinar world, do you have data or off-the-shelf analyses that would be helpful to this process? Again, this is very early in the process. We are just beginning this. And so there are no attempts at excluding any solution or any data set that we've missed. We want to hear from you. So if you have information, if you have data or off-the-shelf analysis that we have not considered, please contact us at drawdown@gatech.edu. That's drawdown@gatech.edu. Next slide. I want to reemphasize the 2 communication portals for you to engage with the team. I just gave you the drawdown@gatech.edu. Also, you can go to georgiadrawdown.org right now and sign up for email updates so that you are aware of what's going on when those questionnaires, when those surveys have become available. Next slide. One thing that we wanted to uplift and bring out to you in this webinar today, we are not doing this in the vacuum. The drawdown framework that you've heard about earlier in the webinar is a template that many others are leveraging in opportunities. the Drawdown Penn State effort, there's an actual conference, September 16th through the 18th at the Penn State Hotel and Conference Center. Research to Action, the Science of Drawdown. We are partnering with, we are engaging with, and in communication with this group, and they encourage other ideas and participation in this conference. So if you are so inclined, we wanted to make sure you knew about this conference. Next slide. A bit closer to home. Now, we're really excited about this. This is the Georgia Climate Conference, Minimizing Georgia's Risk, Maximizing Georgia's Future. This will be held November 7th and 8th at the Emory Conference Center and Hotel. This is organized by the Georgia Climate Project. Now, the Georgia Climate Project is a separate effort, also funded with generous support by the Ray C. Anderson Foundation. It has a broader set of goals beyond the Drawdown Georgia effort. However, they are very much related and leveraging each other. So we are really excited about this conference. We had over 200 sessions proposed. We had an amazing response to this conference, just as we've had an amazing response to this webinar today. For more information, please go to conference.georgiaclimateproject.org. Some of the people involved in Drawdown Georgia are the same people involved in the Georgia Climate Project. Daniel Rockbird at Emory is the PI. There are several people at Georgia Tech, University of Georgia, and the broader set of academic institutions in Georgia that are partners on that project as well. Next slide. And that takes me to my final slide on engagement. Georgia Climate Project. Again, this is a parallel effort that's working in close connection with the Drawdown effort. If you haven't heard of the Georgia Climate Project, and I certainly hope you have by now, we have a website, we're on Twitter, we're on Facebook, and we're on Instagram, and we have key stakeholders. There are an array of projects ongoing. I will mention that at the Climate Conference in November, there will be sessions on Drawdown Georgia. So you'll have an opportunity at that conference in November to learn more about this project, but also about some of the other exciting things that you can, that the Georgia Climate Project has been doing, such as our 40 key science questions for Georgia, our Georgia climate stories, the climate conference, and many other activities that are ongoing. So we encourage you to take a look at that website as well. Next slide. At that point, I am going to turn it back over to our moderators, Dr. Brown, and I believe we're opening it up for Q&A.
Yes, we are. And I'm thinking, in the interest of showing off some of the other smart people on our team, if Jackie Mohan is available, she could answer a question that we've received about the engagement of NGOs that are involved in land management and in conservation and land conservation issues. Are they being engaged somehow? Jackie.
Yes, most definitely. We're at the very early stages of this effort. As you know, Dr. Puneet and I will be meeting again to think about outreach specifically to NGOs, specifically to state and federal scientists working with relevance for Georgia. Before I came to UGA, before I got my PhD, I worked for several years with the Nature Conservancy. And so I definitely am keen to reconnect with colleagues and meet new ones outside of academia as well as inside academia. Yes.
Daniel, have you picked out a question?
Yeah, we got one more.
Oh, one more. Dr. Puneet will be also.
Great. Excellent. Yes, hi.
Hey, so if you are interested to work with us on land use and forestry part, please free to contact us. Our details are there on the website, and we will love to talk to you to make sure that we are moving together as a team when it comes to land use and forestry or for this project as such.
Yes, thank you. And thank you all in advance.
Yeah.
Marilyn, the next one I'd recommend, if Michael is willing, there's a question that says, curious about the decision not to explore women and girls opportunities as a carbon perspective. And I actually think, if I'm not mistaken, I want Michael to clarify that we still are going to look at that and see where it comes out. But Michael, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, we will be looking at that solution. We'll be looking at all three of the sort of less traditional project drawdown solutions in this category, and that is one of them. We'll be trying to refine them such that they're most applicable for a U.S. context, because many of the impacts in project drawdown were higher in emerging economies and developing nations than in the developed world. So we will be certainly taking a look at women and girls, educating women and girls as part of the empowering women and girls as part of one of the solutions that we're looking at. I'll also take the liberty of addressing, there's another question there about our social scientists included in any of the working groups, and we do have David Iwaniak in our group does have a very strong social science background, and we're very pleased to have him as part of our working group. And I should also say we will be speaking with a range of advisors, many of whom have social science backgrounds.
Yeah, I'm very excited to report too that we have received Institutional Review Board approval for a survey. It'll be taking place in 2 stages. The first stage is focusing mostly on what we're missing in terms of solutions and trying to get some help with the initial down selection. The second one's going to be more probing once we have a shorter list, looking at how people are responding to these opportunities, why some solutions are rated more favorably than others. And in doing that, we'll even reach out to non-scientists. I got a question on that as well. Here, will non-scientists be engaged, and what role could they play? So we are going to post this crowdsourced question about what we're missing, hoping to get people to tell us what's on their mind, because ultimately it's going to be, success is going to require the willingness of Georgians to move forward with these solutions. Scroll to the last question. Okay.
Marilyn, do you want me to take one?
Sure, and then I'll tackle the last one when you
Great.
stop.
So one that looks like came up is how are we incorporating students into this effort since it is centered in universities? Good question. I think in a very narrow sense, every one of the universities that are represented here has student research assistants who are invaluable and often doing a really phenomenal job to move this forward. That's in a narrow sense. In a more broad sense, I would flag that there are a number of student networks that are emerged around the state around climate and sustainability, which is fantastic. I know for the Georgia Climate Conference in particular, there's a student advisory group which has 1 to 2 representatives of each of the now 7 schools involved in the Georgia Climate Project, not just those that are here, but also Agnes Scott, Spelman, UNG, Georgia Southern, and soon to be Georgia State. And so that student advisory group is really thinking about how to work with students on not only drawdown, but also the other issues that Marshall mentioned, both in the run-up to that conference in November, certainly at the conference in November, and hopefully beyond that conference. And we would be delighted, I think, to stay in touch with student groups at our universities, but also any networks that are out there about possibilities to creatively engage. I wonder, Kim, if you wanted to mention the Carbon Reduction Challenge is another thing that's quite live that students are getting involved in.
Sure, I will. Thanks, Daniel. Yeah, so every summer we do run a Carbon Reduction Challenge competition, which I think is just a showcase for some of the low-hanging fruit that we have here in Georgia in terms of gaining energy efficiency, sometimes in the built environment, sometimes in transportation sectors, where students partner with local organizations, large and small, to achieve fairly significant reductions. And so that's kind of a nice synergy there that we have to explore some of this, some of the landscape that comes out of this analysis and prioritize some of their work too. So I'm excited about that opportunity.
All right, we've had some great questions coming in. Wish we could tackle them all. Let me take a few of them though. One set of questions is around how we're going to do our estimation of jobs, for instance. What kind of modeling we're planning on doing. Thank you very much for that question, because I forgot to mention that one of the key modeling tools we'll be using here is at Georgia Tech is the National Energy Modeling System, which has been created by the Energy Information Administration. It is the model that is used by the DOE to forecast prices, energy prices and consumption, and to look at technology trends. We're one of just 2 universities that have it up and running for our own research. And our research extends not only to jobs, which it will estimate at a course level, but also to, for instance, a quick look at carbon taxes is possible as well. In the jobs category, though, we're going to have to probably also deploy input-output analysis to look at well the trade-off. So for instance, I have one student who's looking at the jobs impacts of moving to an EV fleet, not just the impact on the construction trades, but also what happens when you have much lower transportation costs, where your operating costs are much lower. There's more money to circulate in the economy, and that money is used to buy other goods and services, which themselves then support new jobs. So we are very familiar with that type of analysis and looking forward to applying some of it. And yeah, Michael.
Can I just add one quick thing, which is we're also very fortunate to have Dr. Laura Taylor on the Beyond Carbon Working Group, who's chair of Georgia Tech's economics department, and so she'll be helping to lead the way on many of those analyses.
Oh, I see a question about the IRP. The IRP was a success for the solar community, though efficiency was not incentivized as it should, although, footnote, there was a low-income program using on-bill financing that was approved in the IRP. Continuing with the question, assuming you will model the impact this expansion has on energy generation emissions, et cetera, assuming that you will model, yes we will, the impact that this expansion has on energy generation and emissions and what more is needed. Absolutely, we have already modeled the IRP within our baseline forecast of electricity generation for the state of Georgia. The IRP calls for a good amount of utility scale solar, and as this questioner knows, not so much energy efficiency. But it turns out that the IRP forecasted levels of investment are right in line with the Department of Energy's forecast for this particular electricity region. So it's very interesting. We're not, it doesn't take us off that line. It's right in line with the forecast of the Energy Information Administration. But we are, of course, really happy that the IRP called for so much solar. And Kim's going to weigh in on this.
Actually, I didn't want to weigh in on that. I wanted to make a plug. I wanted to make a plug for the water question, which I see on there. Just to throw that in there, I think that's a great question. How will you be examining and engaging with the water sector, water management, and water infrastructure? Super important, as so many of our solution sets are going to impact the use of water in our state, and have to consider, of course, the impacts of water variability on some of those solution sets as well. And so we do have access to any number of water resource experts across the different institutions that we have, both at UGA and as well as at Georgia Tech. The Georgia Water Research Institute is cited at Georgia Tech. And so I think this is a good opportunity to note that while we have these leads and advisory groups in place under each working groups, there's really going to be a nexus of people that is going to be engaged much broader than those that are listed on these slides today, as we go into a further and further identification of some of these solution sets. So thank you for that. And if you're one of those people who calls yourself a water stakeholder or practitioner or policy person, please do get in touch, and let's get in early in the game and thinking about what some of those implications are for Georgia. Thank you for that question.
Oh, I see a question about the military. It is a major presence in Georgia, and we, as far as I know, have not engaged them yet, but we certainly need to. So thank you for that recommendation.
And let me just add on that, just if folks have suggestions, just piggybacking off of what Kim said, if there are suggestions of particular organizations or individuals who you think really we should be in touch with, please do email those in to drawdown@gatech.edu. And as we think some of these questions piggyback or spread into the broader climate conversation, we're also quite eager to think about the stakeholder groups that you've identified, water, military, and other, in the context of the conference in November, because as we talk about climate change in general, the military is a great example, and they've spoken out quite a bit on anything from the national security to the operational readiness constraints posed by climate change and their efforts to respond to this.
Mm-hmm. We have a couple of questions about social behavioral change and communications research. We've touched on that a little bit. I did want to note that the buildings and materials working group headed by Dan Matisoff will probably be looking at the ability of smart meters and information programs to assist with, for instance, ability to use demand response programs in the electricity sector and otherwise. Fikret, would you like to say anything about any solutions in the buildings sector that are particularly behavioral?
Yeah, I
you
guess
need
so.
to run on over here and speak into my mic. Fikret is helping. Dan Matisoff is out of the country at the moment. So Fikret, a PhD from Georgia Tech, working hard on this project, is going to speak to this.
No, it's okay.
He's young.
Yeah. No, as far as behavioral impacts go, we'll certainly look at it. Rebound effects are certainly a big issue. Every time we do energy efficiency upgrades, if you kind of don't check for to make sure that people haven't modified their behavior, it can actually counteract the benefits of the energy savings that you see. So we'll be looking at that, and we'll be looking at other things, including deadband range and many other possibilities to see how we can tap into the human factor component and see how we can use that to our benefit.
Yeah. Rich, in transportation, I imagine that there are a lot of issues about modal choice that you'll be dealing with, and I don't know if you've had any opportunity to think about the behavioral types of solutions that could be quantified in terms of costs and benefits. Would you like to say a few words?
Absolutely.
Over here?
So
looking so they can see you and hear you.
Hey, great point. Some of the solutions have different scales, obviously. And so within transportation, one of our solutions is cars, right? But that includes a whole multitude of classifications of cars. So that's a very good point. We're looking at electric vehicles as a subset of that, but also other more efficient conventional platforms for cars. But then we have other much more well-defined solutions like electric bikes and ride sharing and mass transit. So I think there is a lot of overlap. We're working with Michael and the Beyond Carbon group to understand, the consumer's choice when it comes to mobility and understand how substitution effects will work. But right now we're collecting a lot of data on the current footprint. And, there was a question that I saw earlier I would touch on briefly in terms of the 2030 target that you mentioned. Even though we're looking multiple decades, we really do want to try to emphasize solutions that can have an impact within that decade without precluding things that obviously are much more transformational, for which some of the behavioral impacts would be seeing it. So
yeah, great. Michael.
I did see a question. Just want to clarify perhaps something I said, that with reference to some of the less traditional solutions that are in Project Drawdown, I had alluded to the impacts, the carbon impacts of those solutions in emerging economies, where the intent of my comment was simply to say that we're looking at what would be the carbon impact of those solutions or solutions similar to those in a developed economy, and specifically in the state of Georgia. The expectation is, as they are currently articulated in Project Drawdown, the carbon impacts within the time horizon that we're looking at would not be as significant. And I just wanted to clarify that comment.
The next question, Marilyn, that seems to jump up a lot, there were questions both about the timeline, which I think to some degree Rich addressed, but also about a lot of people asking questions about specific policy solutions ranging from the Green New Deal to carbon tax, and several others. With respect to a carbon tax in particular, and Marilyn and others, please jump in after this. I think the general approach right now is we, just as Drawdown did globally, we're starting with the world as it is now and using that as our baseline. That means the policy suite that's in place right now, as well as the technology portfolio that's in place right now. And that's what we're using as a starting point for our baseline. We have an ability with the tools that Marilyn has described to then look at a number of other policy scenarios that might go into, if we think about a business as usual scenario and think about some alternatives, it might be that we do want to model in what happens if there is a price placed on carbon at the state level or another level over the time period that we're looking at. So right now, again, the baseline is to not factor in a price on carbon, but that's without prejudice to whether or not that is considered in a number of alternate scenarios as we try to look into the crystal ball and see what the art of the possible is with respect to reducing emissions. That said, as I mentioned at the outset, this is initially, this phase, everything from now through the spring is about looking at the most promising solutions, not yet a discussion of the levers and the accelerants and the policies and the programs that might put those solutions into action. It's much more looking at specific solution spaces and seeing which of those has the most potential to reduce carbon at a low cost while maximizing any co-benefits and minimizing the risks that come from a beyond carbon perspective. I'm just going to round it out. I think we've already addressed the 2030 question, but just to maybe wrap it up one more time. 2030 is a big focus for us. It's not the exclusive focus. We're also looking beyond 2030. We'll look short of 2030 as well. We are trying to get a sense of what our opportunities and options are over the next several decades, with 2030 being certainly a key focus area. Marilyn, did you have anything else you wanted to add on that?
No, that's good. I think the last question I'd like to end with is a couple of questions that have focused on whether we're going to be mostly urban centric, and absolutely not. We know that Georgia is a rural state. There are plenty of opportunities in small towns and rural Georgia. Some of these we've been looking at in Albany, for instance, a small town in South Georgia. And I know that the ag and food systems and forest working groups are clearly going to be focused on rural Georgia. So I'm very pleased that while I probably overemphasize with my Sankey diagrams what it looks like an urban take on Georgia, it's not. And so we'll just keep reminding us if anybody sees us going too urban, although urban's good too. Anyway. Okay, well with that I'd like to wrap with a very big thank you to you all. We are undertaking an ambitious effort that is very timely and important, and is befitting the aspirations of 3 great Georgia universities. But as we've noted, we need your help. Our success depends on the engagement of many of experts and stakeholders and common citizens, all across the state. With that in mind, please send us your ideas and keep in touch. And if you have contacts or resources that we might be able to take advantage of, we would really like to hear about them. So stay tuned and stay in touch. Thank you very much.